I am here to talk to you about The Truthsayers, Apprentice by Deborah Christian. This is a fantasy novel about a boy named Dalin, who is the apprentice to his grand uncle, who is the truthsayer of this kingdom. And then on like page 2 or 3, his grand uncle is murdered, and then the bandits who did it, they steal the truthsayer's robe, which is part of his office. It's what helps him do his duty of truth-saying. They steal it, and so then Dalin is trying to get it back. And so then Dalin, he ends up hooking up with a group of elves and one dwarf who they were going to visit the Truthsayer, and then they got sidetracked because they had to rescue Dalin, and then they also want to get a hold of the robe. And then the rest of the book is basically just a series of, I talked about in my review of Basil Broketail, how if you're not really sure where you want your story to go, you can try the try-fail cycle. Your characters want to do something, they have something they want to accomplish. Do they succeed? Yes, but this other thing happens that they have to deal with, or no, and this other thing happens that complicates their lives even further. So the premise is relatively simple. You have basically 4 different groups of people who all want the Truthsayer's robe. You have Dalin, and then the group that he's with, and Dalin doesn't really trust them for pretty good reason. And then you have the bandits who killed his grand uncle, and then within that group, you have one guy who is also working against the rest of his group. So you have 4 different factions who all want this group, and then at various times, okay, this guy, he succeeds in doing something, but then it kind of backfires on him, so then the story takes a direction over here. And then Dalin tries to do this, and then that backfires on him, and so then the story has to go in this direction. And I feel like I liked the plot quite a bit, but I was about 100 pages in, and I looked up some reviews of this book, and I saw several people saying that they just didn't care about the characters. And I saw at least one review said they were 100 pages in, and they just put it aside because they didn't care about what was happening. And I realized, oh yeah, I'm about 100 pages in, and I also don't really care about the characters. And I think part of that is the author is trying to balance way too many characters in this story. You have Dalin, who is allegedly your main character, but then there is a stretch of like 50 pages where we do not spend any time with him at all. And then he hooks up with a group of like 5 or 6 other characters, and then their antagonists, there's about 5 or 6 people in that group. So you've already got like 12 people that you are dealing with. And then at one point, Dalin and his group, they hook up with some more people to try and catch the bandits. And then, spoilers, those people die, and then they get to the big city where the last half of our book takes place, and then we introduce even more characters to our good group of characters. And it's just way too much to keep up with. Even in a 450-page book, there are way too many characters here, and unfortunately, I can't tell you a lot about any of them. When you introduce more characters into a book, each one gets a piece of the pie, and therefore each piece of the pie gets smaller. And so really, Dalin is the one that I can tell you the most about, but even him, I can't tell you a whole lot about him. It's over 100 pages in at one point. They are in a hotel in the big city, and then he kind of has a minor panic attack saying, like, I'm not used to this. I don't like any of this. I would prefer to just go and sleep on a pile of straw outside because that's what I'm used to living out in the country. And I realized that was like the big thing that I could tell you about this main character. I really don't know a whole lot about any of these characters. And part of that is this group that Dalin is working with, they are not necessarily working in Dalin's best interests. They want the Truthsayer's robe for themselves, and Dalin sees it as his birthright. And you have to wait until like the 3rd to last page of the book to find out why these guys want this robe. And I will go ahead and tell you right now, if you are planning on writing a story, if you have a big mystery that you are teasing your audience with, the longer you wait on revealing what that mystery is, the more disappointing it's going to be. And ultimately, this mystery was incredibly disappointing. For one, it just wasn't that interesting of a reason, and I feel like we could have found out like 250 pages earlier, and it would have shortened the book quite a bit. And I wonder if Deborah Christian thought, well, I want to write an epic fantasy series, and each book has to be like crazy long, 450 pages, because that's what Tolkien did. Tolkien wrote these really long stories, multiple books in this series, and so I need to write a really long series. So I have to stretch out this mystery. There's a reason that these guys want the robe, but they're not going to tell Dalin for reasons, and the reason is, well, we want to stretch out the book, because if they were honest with Dalin, then a whole lot of the plot complications would go away, and then you would have maybe a 200-page book. But it's also disappointing because when I looked this up, when I bought it a few years ago, the internet touted this as book 1 of the Loregiver series, but it's actually book only of the Loregiver series. Deborah Christian wrote, I think, 2 or 3 other books before this, and I looked into it. Apparently one of those books is set in the same world as this book, but has nothing to do with this book. But then she wrote this. It came out in 1999, and then she did not write any other books until 2014, and that has nothing to do with the Loregiver series. So she teases us with this mystery. Why does Thingol and the rest of these elves and this dwarf, why do they want the Truthsayers' robe? Ooh, it's a big mystery. Aren't you excited? And then she tells us, and then hints that there's going to be more with these characters, and then no, we get nothing. And I will say the book more or less wraps up everything with Dalin and the antagonists who also want the robe. It wraps up all of that just fine, but then throughout a major chunk of the book, we are left scratching our heads at why do Dalin's friends, why do they want the robe? And then when we finally find out, it's kind of a tease for later books that we are never going to get. Ultimately, I would say I did not hate the book. It's a very frustrating read, but I didn't hate it. I feel like if you combine this with Sword of the Maiden's Tears, which is a book I talked about maybe a couple years ago that was quite a bit shorter than this, but I feel like this book and that book, they suffer from opposite problems. Sword of the Maiden's Tears opens up with something really exciting that happens on like page 2, and then you get like well over 100 pages where nothing of consequence happens. But I feel like I knew all of the characters in that book very well. Those characters were defined very clearly. I could tell you about each of those characters. It's been over a year and a half since I read that book, and I could still tell you about each of those characters. They all have clear character traits that distinguish them from each other. But there was almost no plot for those interesting characters to participate in. And then you have this book where you have upwards of 16, 17 characters, and I can tell you almost nothing about any of them, but there is a whole lot of plot for these completely boring non-characters to participate in. And I feel like if you were to combine this book with Sword of the Maiden's Tears, you would either get a really interesting, really exciting book with really good characters participating in a really fun, fast-paced plot, or you would get the most boring book in the world with a whole bunch of non-characters participating in a non-plot for over 2/3 of the book. And I don't know which one you would get, but I feel like this has the exact opposite problem of that book. And I wish that we could have just trimmed down some of these characters. There are so many characters here where I feel like they just don't serve a purpose here. At one point, when we're over halfway into the book, we introduce some new characters that are squires for Thingol the elf, and I'm thinking, okay, one of these characters, she does quite a bit. The others, they don't do anything. They don't need to be here. You could just excise so much of the fat in this book and then try to develop the characters that do serve a plot purpose here, and I think you would have a much better story. So unfortunately, I do not recommend the Truthsayers Apprentice. I hope you guys like this review, and I will be back in the future with something else. In the meantime, have a great rest of your day. Catch you later.